Kia ora everyone, we're just waiting for everyone to come in. Welcome to the Biometrics webinar. We'll just wait for a few minutes while people trickle in. Don't worry, it hasn't frozen, we're just waiting for people to come in. Hi everyone, we're just waiting for people to come in. Looks like it might be.
Yep. Start. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai ki tēnei kauhau, te wāhanga whakamutunga o tēnei wiki, te wiki o te matatapu. Ko Ewan Lincoln tōku ingoa. So I'm Ewan Lincoln, I'm a Principal Policy Advisor here at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. Welcome to this session on biometrics. Hopefully that's what you're all here for. This is the very last session of Privacy Week. So I will just let my colleague here introduce herself.
Kia ora everyone, my name's Griffiths. I'm a policy advisor here at OPC and I've had the pleasure of working with Ewan on the policy work looking at regulation of biometrics in New Zealand.
So really glad that you're all able to join us today and just thought it'd be useful to let you know what we'll be covering. So we're going to start out with just a little introduction to what is this thing called biometrics we're talking about, a little bit about what's the current situation with regulation of biometrics in Aotearoa, New Zealand, then looking at some of the opportunities and risks involved with biometric technologies, a bit of a survey of some of the regulation that we're aware of in other countries, then starting to look at what we've been doing here at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, some of the issues and questions that are sort of coming up for us as we do undertake this work. And then lastly, we'll just look at what's coming up in the work that we're doing here in the future. So that's what we'll be covering. Hopefully that's kind of what you're here for. Now, we need to be clear, we don't claim to be technical experts on biometrics. What we, our expertise lies in privacy, but we hopefully have got enough of an understanding now of biometrics to be able to think about the intersections between biometric technologies and privacy legislation. So just a very quick introduction then to what is biometrics and some of the processes involved. So biometrics is often used as a shorthand for what's also called biometric recognition. So this is recognizing individuals based on their biological characteristics or their behavioral characteristics. So for example, their biological characteristics could be their face, fingerprints, voice, eyes. Behavioral is maybe a bit less common, and that could be things like the way that they move, their keystroke patterns, those kind of things. Biometric information then is the information about those biological or behavioral characteristics. So if we think about the pattern of someone's fingerprint, that's biometric information. But also then if you turn that into a digital template, that fingerprint pattern, then that's also biometric information in a very broad sense. And I just used that word template there, and essentially that's just a digital mathematical representation of a biometric characteristic. So you take the actual fingerprint, say, you turn it into a set of data points, and then you turn those data points into ones and zeros, very, very crudely. And that's crudely in the sense of the description of the template. I'm not saying it's a crude process. There are three broad types of uses for biometrics. The first one is verifying verification or confirming identity, sometimes called one-to-one matching. So is this person who they say they are? I present myself and I say that I'm Ewan Lincoln, and the organisation I'm dealing with wants to know, am I the Ewan Lincoln that they have in their records? Identification, determining the identity of a person who you don't immediately know. You want to know, basically, are they on your database? So maybe I'm in some sort of venue. They want to know, they don't know immediately who I am, but they want to know, have I already been flagged as a person of interest for some reason? And so they'll search me against the people who are on their database. And then the third and less common type of use of biometrics is classification. So that's trying to gain insights about, say, a person's ethnicity or gender, or it could be something about their mood. In this case, they may or may not be interested in the identity of the person. So in this case, an organisation is interacting with me and might use biometric technology to find out, am I stressed or am I angry, and do they need to take particular steps as a result of determining that. Now, this is a very simplified account of how the most common types of biometric matching work. It's not to say that it works like this in all circumstances, and this is really just talking about those two most common uses of verification and identification. So essentially, you've got someone's information, their biometric characteristic is enrolled into a database. So they capture your biometric image, they then convert it into a template, that becomes what's called a reference. Then the person presents themselves again at a later date. Then they capture the person's biometric characteristic again, convert it into a template, and then they're comparing what they call the query reference against the stored reference, and to see whether those two things appear to match. And then the fourth step that's shown there, the decision, is essentially a probability decision. It's about saying, does this person appear to a high degree of probability to be the same person? It's not saying with 100% certainty they are the same person, but it's a exercise in probability, essentially. Now, some of the specific uses of biometrics, they're quite wide-ranging, but here are some of the contexts in which biometric technologies might be used. So we've heard a bit during the course of this week about digital identity. And so verifying identities online using biometric technologies is a form of digital identity confirmation, I guess. So you might use, say, facial recognition to verify that you are the customer of this particular entity that you're dealing with, or in some other way to verify your identity online. Border control is something else that people might be quite familiar with, going through passport control at an airport and having your face matched against the facial image on your passport. Law enforcement, so obviously police might be looking to determine whether someone that they have obtained an image of matches someone who's already in their records. Retail security, so this is where, say, facial recognition might be used to identify people who are known to be shoplifters or who've been abusive towards staff and have been flagged as people of interest, perhaps trespassed from the store. Is somewhat similar in approach, but different in purpose, is where facial recognition technology might be used for problem gamblers who've been excluded from a gambling venue, in some cases actually excluded by themselves. And in that circumstance, the facial recognition technology could be used to identify that this is a problem gambler and that steps need to be taken to address the fact that they're in the gambling venue. Then something that a lot of us will be familiar with if we use perhaps a fingerprint or a facial image to unlock a smartphone is when biometrics is used to control access to a space or a device. So the device is obviously a smartphone. Controlling access to a space might be like a secure room or a secure area where you might have to be scanned before going into that area. And then another example in the employment context could be essentially clocking on, clocking off using, say, a fingerprint. So those are just some examples of specific ways in which biometric technologies might be used. Now, biometric information is already regulated under the Privacy Act. So it's personal information. It falls within the definition of personal information under the Privacy Act. So the Privacy Act and the 13 privacy principles do apply to biometric information. In the view of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, biometric information is also sensitive personal information. That's because it's unique to the individual, it's directly connected to the body and to the sense of individual identity, and it's also very difficult to change. So unlike other types of personal information or identifying information, it's difficult to change your your biological or behavioural characteristics. So it's a very particular and sensitive type of information, and it needs to be treated accordingly. As the regulator, our objective is always to maintain the benefits of different types of technology that processes personal information, but also to protect against the risks of those technologies and those uses. Good regulation can help to provide protection when biometric information is collected, used, or disclosed. And good regulation can also enable safe and beneficial uses of technologies. It's also important to note that there's some other legislation that deals with biometrics. For example, there's specific provisions in the Immigration Act and in some other legislation. And depending on how that particular legislation is worded, it's also important to know that other legislation can override the Privacy Act. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Ella to talk about opportunities and risks.
Cool. Thanks, Ewan. And for those of you who have entered a bit later, this webinar will be recorded, so if you missed the start, you can go back and watch that. So using biometrics poses both risks and opportunities, and it's helpful to be conscious of both when we're thinking about how we might best regulate biometrics. Biometrics is generally a highly effective and reliable way of uniquely verifying and identifying individuals. So this is unlike knowledge-based verification systems, so passwords or PINs, or token-based systems, ID cards or licenses. Biometric data is unique to an individual, does not change, or it changes a little bit when you age maybe, and it cannot be easily transferred, lost, or duplicated. This means biometrics is ideal for identity management and authentication purposes. And in a world where we increasingly operate online with a heavy reliance on passwords and PINs to protect our accounts or access services, it's easy to see the benefits of biometrics, especially given the rise of scams and data breaches. At OPC, we're very aware of the damage that can be done through bad actors using lost or compromised credentials to commit fraud or scam people. And biometrics is one of a number of tools that can help combat this. Biometrics is also in general, a very efficient way of verifying or identifying individuals at high volumes compared to manual processes. This is beneficial, avoiding long queues at customs to emergency responses where speed of identification is crucial. So now I'm just going to talk a bit about the risks of biometrics. While they are generally really highly effective and reliable at verification and identification, biometric systems determine matches on a probabilistic basis, as Ewan explained before, which means it is possible for the system to produce a false positive, so that's incorrectly detecting a match, or a false negative, failure to detect a match. And there are a number of factors that affect the performance of biometric systems. The quality of the biometric information at enrolment, or the environment, such as the lighting, whether the user is wearing a mask, for instance. And I had someone tell me recently that they struggle to open their laptop with their fingerprint after they've gone rock climbing because of the calluses that build up on their fingers. And going on from accuracy, so biometric technologies are not immune from being gamed. Spoofing refers to a scheme where an actor uses fake biometric information to bypass a biometric system. For example, an imitation fingerprint or playing a recording to get through voice recognition. And there have been developments to protect against spoofing, such as liveness detection. However, rapid advances in AI do raise concerns about the ability for synthetic faces, videos, fingerprints, and voices created by AI to bypass these systems. And as our reliance on biometric technologies increase, so will bad actors think of more creative ways to game them. There are a couple of ways that bias and discrimination can arise in the deployment of biometric technologies. One, it may be inherent in the technology, or two, it can arise in the way the technology is used. In terms of bias inherent in the technology, there have been findings that facial recognition systems, for example, have different accuracy levels for different people, depending on their skin tone, gender, or age. And this can arise from things like lack of diversity in the data set, which means that technology is going to perform better for certain demographics. When you do have a technology that allows you to scale up something like identification or classification of individuals to a great extent, there's also a risk that existing systematic flaws or biases are exacerbated. So for example, in 2001, the UK changed their law and they allowed police to collect biometric data, DNA and fingerprints in a really wide range of circumstances and to retain it indefinitely. And this led to a huge DNA database being created. I think it was the largest in the world at the time. And of course, the retained data was disproportionately weighted towards people and communities who had high contact with police, whether or not they were an offender. So groups like young Black men were disproportionately represented on that database. One of the things that comes up a bit is thinking about inappropriate or disproportionate use. So, for instance, live facial recognition technology permits agencies to identify and surveil large groups of people in a way that wasn't possible before. This year in New York, several lawyers found themselves denied entry to entertainment venues like Madison Square Garden. And it turned out that the owner of the venues had created a blacklist of lawyers who worked at firms that were involved in legal action against him. The venue likely scraped the photos of these lawyers from the internet and then used facial recognition technology to pick them out of the crowd. So there's a risk that biometrics are used for purposes where the benefit may not outweigh the intrusion into privacy or the potential harms, or in fact infringe on other rights like freedom of movement. And we may consider this to be an inappropriate or disproportionate use. In Australia, the privacy regulator there, the OAAC, found that 7-Eleven, the convenience store, was collecting their customers' biometric data while they filled out feedback forms. And the OAAC determines that the collection of biometric data in this instance was not reasonably necessary for the purpose of understanding and improving customers' in-store experience. So it was a disproportionate collection. Related to that, talking about use, is the risk of function creep. The Privacy Act does allow for information to be used for a directly related purpose to the purpose that the information was collected for, but it does raise the question of will this always be appropriate in the context of biometrics. And last two risks I'll talk about, immutability. Unlike passwords or your driver's license, biometric characteristics cannot be reset or cancelled. So this makes the stakes higher if an individual's biometric data is compromised in some way. And some types of biometric information, particularly face or a voice, can be collected covertly. For instance, collected via information that's already in the public arena. You may have heard of Clearview AI. Clearview AI is a facial recognition platform who created the world's largest database of people's faces by scraping photos from publicly available sources on the internet. Clients, such as law enforcement, but also others, could pay for access to the database and use facial recognition technology to identify individuals. Clearview AI has been subject to privacy enforcement action by multiple privacy regulators. And most recently, it was fined by the French data regulator 5.2 million euro for not complying with an order to delete data on individuals located in France. So that comes to the end of the section talking about risks. And in this next section, I'm going to take us through just a brief survey of what overseas jurisdictions are doing to regulate biometrics. As we've been thinking about regulation of biometrics in New Zealand, it's always helpful to look at what other privacy regulators are doing. A couple of disclaimers. This is not an exhaustive survey. And two, this is not necessarily an indication of how OPC may look to regulate biometrics in New Zealand. So on the left there, I have the regulatory setting, which is just jargon for the formal and informal rules a regulator may use to shape an industry or practice. So one of the settings is around scope or definitions of biometric data. As Ewan will mention later, scope is an important question when thinking about regulation. So what information will be covered by the definition of biometric data, and what information will fall outside. So generally, definitions of biometric data include a link to its use for verification or identification via an automated or biometric process. So you can see there in the GDPR in Australia definition. The GDPR is the EU's privacy law, and it refers, so the acronym means General Data Protection Regulation. So the GDPR definition has a requirement for specific technical processing and unique identification. So not just any method to analyze the characteristics of humans will result in biometric data under that definition. So a photograph may not be biometric data unless it's processed by biometric technology. And this can be, you can see more broader definitions there, like the Californian one. And speaking of scope, we may need to think about whether our scope should include animals. Facial recognition technology is not just used for humans, but also being used to identify cows.
But spoiler, I don't think we are going to look at facial recognition of cows. Sorry to disappoint any cows out there.
Another regulatory setting or option that other jurisdictions have used is some jurisdictions have special categories of data that attract greater restrictions on the collection, use, and disclosure, and they include biometric data in these special categories. So in Australia, they have a sensitive information category. In the GDPR, it's literally called special category. Privacy Act doesn't have one. And yeah, so for example, in Australia, sensitive information has higher restrictions on when you can collect it, and it also has restrictions around use or disclosure for direct marketing purposes. Consent. So it's fairly common for privacy law to require consent from individuals to the collection of their biometric information, with some exceptions. And under the GDPR, the bar is quite high for consent. Explicit consent means freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. Some privacy regulators are requiring more stringent notice requirements when using biometrics. So in New York, signs must use simple language and be clear and conspicuous. And similarly in British Columbia, must have a fulsome notification. And their reasoning behind that is they say that an agency cannot assume that everyone will understand what facial recognition technology is, or the implications and risks of disclosing this. There are some jurisdictions who have placed restrictions on the commercialization of biometric data. In Illinois and New York, private agencies may not sell, trade, or profit from biometric data. Some cities in the US have outright banned the use of facial recognition technology by private entities, Baltimore and Portland. In Quebec, the Privacy Commissioner requires private companies to notify them if they have a biometric database. Notifying the regulator about the use of biometrics can provide the public and the regulator with a greater awareness and oversight of how these technologies are being employed. Guidance can be a great tool for to clarify what the privacy regulator expects from agencies. And the Singaporean data regulator has issued very detailed guidance on biometrics. And the ICO in the UK plans to release guidance soon. And lastly, the UK opted for a dedicated biometrics commissioner, whose role is to oversee and review police use and retention of DNA and fingerprints, I believe, which reflects the potential very serious consequences for individuals if their data is misused or abused in this context. That comes to the end of the survey, so I'll now hand back to Ewan.
Great, thanks, Ella. So I'm going to talk now about what the Office of the Privacy Commissioner has been doing and what we will be doing in relation to privacy regulation of biometrics. So we're kind of responding to a changing landscape, and some of the components of that are that the uses of biometrics are increasing and diversifying, both within New Zealand and internationally. Some of the things that might be happening internationally might not have come here yet, but they probably will in time. There have been calls for stronger regulation in New Zealand of biometrics, particularly facial recognition, to better protect privacy and human rights. And an example of that is a report that came out in 2020 into regulation of facial recognition in New Zealand that was funded by the Law Foundation. And that called for a number of measures to, as they saw it, to provide better protection in relation to the use of facial recognition technology. Concerns have been raised about the implications of biometrics for Māori, for example, from Te Mana Raronga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and those relate to the nature of biometric information and also to the potential impacts on Māori. Then there's a desire for greater regulatory clarity, and that regulatory clarity will hopefully allow organisations to innovate and to will promote uptake of safe uses of biometrics, while at the same time assuring the public that their information will be used safely, and also empower the Office of the Privacy Commissioner as regulator. And then lastly, as we've been hearing from Ella's survey, there's a greater focus internationally on biometrics. I mean, firstly, some other jurisdictions are ahead of us in terms of how they cover biometrics already, plus they're thinking about more kind of guidance or laws or other measures to adapt to changing uses. And we need to kind of keep up with what's happening internationally, both to provide the best possible protection to people within New Zealand and also to maintain our reputation as a country that protects human rights and protects privacy. So with all of that in mind, and also with the risks that Ella has outlined in mind, in 2021, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner put out our position paper on biometrics. And this had a number of key purposes. Firstly, just to explain how the Privacy Act applies to biometrics, including how the different privacy principles might apply. To set out our expectations as the regulator, and to contribute to the wider discussion about biometric regulation that was already going on. Probably the key regulatory expectation that we set in that paper is that where an organisation is looking at a project that has a key biometric component, that it should do a privacy impact assessment. Now, of course, privacy impact assessment is a really important tool for any project that has privacy implications, but even more so, and it needs to be done perhaps even more rigorously when we're talking about this type of sensitive information that is biometric information. So the position paper, as I've said, it included discussion of how the privacy principles apply, and it also had some questions for people to think about when they're doing their privacy impact assessments. And just a couple of those questions are, has the sensitivity of biometric information been considered? And is the proposed use of biometrics targeted and proportionate, having regard to the benefits and the risks? And I think those two questions go to a fairly fundamental point, which is that your privacy impact assessment shouldn't just say, okay, we're going to do this thing, it involves biometrics, so how can we mitigate the risks? You've got to, first of all, look at, should you even be doing this in the first place? Is it justified, targeted, proportionate? Is it even going to be effective in responding to the concerns that you're trying to address? You've kind of got to go through that step first. Then you've got to think about what other options there are that could perhaps be less privacy intrusive. And once you've been through that process, and if you then feel that the use of biometrics is justified, then you can look at the mitigations that you might need to put in place. Then last year we decided, following up on the position paper, to maybe dive a bit deeper and to put out a consultation paper on biometrics. And so what we were looking for from people was, firstly, we wanted to understand more about what's already happening and people's thoughts about use of biometrics. So what uses are they aware of? What concerns do people have? What risks do they see? We wanted to hear what people think about the regulatory expectations we set in the position paper, and whether any further regulatory measures were needed, if so, what. We discussed some fairly high-level options that could be considered. One is that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner could put out further guidance. Another, which is not so much something that we would pursue, but potentially we could support or encourage, is the development of more detailed, I guess, perhaps more technical standards, whether those be governmental or non-governmental. The third one, which I'll come back to because it's one that we're actively exploring, is a code of practice under the Privacy Act. And then lastly, there's the option of actually amending the law, amending perhaps the Privacy Act, or putting in other legislation specifically dealing with biometrics. Now, of course, also you can have more than one of these options, and it's not like you have to pick only one. What we heard from people was, well, firstly, we got 100 submissions, about half of those just from general members of the public, others from organisations and sort of specialists in the area. We held a number of meetings as well. And in terms of some of the organisations and specialists we heard from, that included users of biometrics in both government and private sector, vendors of biometric technologies, advocacy groups for human rights, privacy, disability, and so on, Māori data specialists, and individual experts and academics. There was quite a wide range of views that we heard, but most submitters supported some further regulatory intervention. In terms of what that intervention might look like, there was roughly equal support for either some more guidance or a code under the Privacy Act. And what people were looking for overall was greater regulatory clarity, so more clarity for organisations about what are the rules they need to comply with, and then also better privacy protection for this sensitive personal information. We heard specifically some concerns from Māori, and those were, as I've kind of already alluded to, the nature of biometric information, the idea that it is directly connected to whakapapa and is potentially tapu and is taonga. And then also about the potential impacts on Māori, so issues of bias, profiling, contributing further to over-surveillance of Māori. So what then did the Privacy Commissioner decide? Well, the Commissioner announced at the end of last year that he'd be exploring the option of a code of practice for biometrics under the Privacy Act. This conclusion was partly based on the outcomes of the consultation and also based on our own assessment. So what is a code? We have a number of codes already under the Privacy Act. You might be familiar, say, with the Health Information Privacy Code, the Credit Reporting Code. There's a number of codes that exist already. And what a code can do is actually modify the privacy principles. So they can make the privacy principles more or less stringent in relation to a particular type of information, a particular sector or activity. Now, that doesn't mean that the Commissioner has decided there will definitely be a code. It means that we're looking at the option of a code. We're going to be engaging around the idea of a code, and a final decision will follow that further engagement. Sorry, just a slight technical problem. Right. Oh, yes. So some of the questions that we're thinking about, and these are just illustrative, really, some questions that we'll need to work through in thinking about a code, or even if we were thinking about further, more detailed guidance. One that Ella's already alluded to is the question of scope. So internationally, a lot of regulation of biometrics is focused on biometric information that has been processed through biometric technology and is used in an automated system. And is also tends to be focused, or really is exclusively focused on identity type of purposes. That's the verification and identification. But there's a question about whether regulation should also cover that use, that broad category of use of classification. That would be quite innovative if we did include that in regulation or in, say, in a code here. But it's something that is being looked at more internationally as the, that type of use of biometrics is starting to come into greater prominence. So we need to think about whether we want to bring that into it. And then are we talking about all types of biometric information or only some? So there's some quite fundamental questions of scope that we need to work through. How can regulatory measures be targeted to risk? And then that maybe kind of ties into another question I've got down there, which is, should there just be one generic set of rules for all biometric information, or should there be specific rules for some types of uses? For example, live facial recognition. Now, within a code, you could actually potentially have both. You could have some generic rules, and then you could have one or more schedules that might have some more specific rules as well. A really important question that we want to hear more views on is how to address impacts on Māori and compliance with Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Another thing that we're looking at is whether consent should be required for the collection of the biometric information, as is the case in some other countries. This would be, again, a bit of a departure for the Privacy Act framework, which is not, essentially is not consent-based, it's more purpose-based. But we are thinking whether that should be something we should look at, given the sensitivity of this information. If we did have a consent approach, what exceptions would we need to build into that? And then another question, which has sort of been coming up in some of the discussions of artificial intelligence during the week, is if you want these systems to become more accurate, arguably they need more training data, more data of people's actual biometric information to train the systems on. But where do you get that data? Do you allow people to essentially harvest data from public sources, even though it's being used for a purpose that it wasn't originally collected for? So that's another question that might need to be considered. Finally, what are our next steps? So we'll be undertaking targeted engagement with key stakeholders and our Māori partners to test ideas for a code, and indeed to test whether a code seems to be the best approach. So we'll be talking to the likes of users and vendors of biometric systems in the public and private sectors, NGO advocacy groups, Māori data specialists, and individual experts. So at some stage later this year, there'll be an announcement of where we're going with this, i.e., does the Commissioner think that a code is still the way forward? And if so, what are the broad parameters of what that code is proposed to include? What are some of the key regulatory expectations that will be included in the code? So then if the decision is to go ahead with a code, the next stage is to actually consult on a draft code. So a code will be drafted. That drafting will obviously take account of some of the feedback that we've received to date. And that draft code will go out for public consultation, and anyone can make a submission on the code, and we would absolutely encourage everyone who has an interest in this area to make a submission at that point. We'll then have a look at the submissions and make final decisions about the code, and the Commissioner will decide what changes might be made to the draft, and then make the final decision to go ahead with the code. So then the code would be issued, and we would at that point need to also wrap around the code some further guidance and materials to help agencies comply with the new requirements of the code. And lastly, there would be ongoing monitoring from our office of how things are going with the code, compliance, and also investigation of complaints, because a code essentially has the same effect as the Privacy Act itself, i.e. you can complain about a breach of the code, and it's just the same as complaining about a breach of the Act. So those are the steps that are coming up. Just need to reinforce once again that there's no decision that there will definitely be a code. We're still very much in the process of exploring the code option. So if you've got any further questions or comments, you can firstly go to the page on our website that has all of our information about biometrics. And you can also email us at biometrics@privacy.org.nz, and happy to take any questions or comments at that email address. But also, speaking of questions and comments, we will now start having a look through what has come through for this seminar. So I know up front there were a couple of questions that were essentially asking about security protections for biometrics. And so I think my response to that would be that certainly any new code would include some kind of requirements around security, and clearly taking steps such as the person here has mentioned, information being hashed or similarly obscured. I mean, I can't get into those kind of technicalities, but some kind of requirements of security protections could be included as part of a code. We would expect they would be, but also remembering that there could be other instruments such as industry standards and so on that can also set some of those expectations. Sorry, we're just scanning the questions here. Andrew Chen has noted the European Union vote yesterday, which will ban live biometric surveillance, including facial recognition, amongst other things. And that's certainly something that we'll be following very closely as part of our keeping up with what's happening internationally.
Yeah, that's interesting. Eduardo has asked about a change in legislation. I think when we undertake targeted engagement, that will be definitely something we'll be asking key stakeholders, is whether a code is enough or whether there needs to be more or less even, and whether guidance is enough in this space. But that's a question that we'll certainly grapple with, and we'll be really interested to hear from our key stakeholders in this area.
There's a question from Gehan about whether the rules would cover all of the IPPs, that's the information privacy principles. For example, stricter rules requiring erasure of raw images after templates have been created, purpose limitations banning certain uses, etc. So I think all I could say around that is the rules might cover all of the IPPs or might cover only some of them. It's too soon to say. But they do need to connect back to the IPPs. And I think that's something that's important to understand, because that will be a limitation on what the code can address, because there does have to be some connection to the privacy principles in the Privacy Act.
Kara's asked a question about limits around consent, and that is an interesting question. You know, can you consent? Could you potentially be asked to consent to a wide range of things? And yes, the privacy principles will still apply, the other privacy principles, and you'd still have to be using it, you know, for the purpose you collected it, and line with disclosure, or other requirements that we might put in the code. And yeah, that is an interesting question about consent. And it was interesting to look overseas, like with the GDPR, they've got yeah, quite explicit consent. It's quite a particular form of consent.
Frith has asked about, could you please clarify what you're contemplating in terms of whether any regulation should cover classification? So I just have to emphasize that this is, you know, still quite a, you know, we're still very open-minded about whether it should. Just to reiterate what we mean by classification. So this is where you're using biometric technologies for a purpose that's not identity focused, but is about determining something about that person. For example, trying to determine their emotion. So that's what that is covering. What that would look like, too soon to say.
Vicky's asked about collection and use of behavioural biometrics. That is something that we're aware of. We're not sure of the extent to where it's being used in New Zealand or not. I know the ICO has talked a bit about that, and yeah, that's definitely something we'll be looking at, especially with the classification, which sort of encompasses that.
James has asked a question which is saying, if an organisation determines there's a necessity to use a biometric technology, They select a reasonable technology and use, and their assessment looks to mitigate risks, and the OPC disagrees. What happens then? That's a tricky kind of a compliance issue, but it is always up to the agency, the organisation itself, to make its own assessment of whether it feels that it's complying with the Privacy Act. We don't act as gatekeepers and kind of, approve or disapprove particular proposed uses. But if we did disagree, and if we actually thought that a particular use was in breach of the Privacy Act, then it's always open to our office to take compliance action using the various compliance measures that exist under the Act. I know that's a bit of a vague question, but it really, it all depends, I think, is the short answer.
Colin's asked a question about forcing it, especially in the privacy sector, forcing a code. Yeah, my two responses to that would be, I think we'd be trying to get engagement with the private sector through our targeted consultation, and getting buy-in from them around the kind of regulation that we were looking at. And in terms of enforcement, the Privacy Act 2020 did sort of bolster the officer's enforcement powers, and we have a dedicated compliance and enforcement team. So yeah, there's definitely compliance actions we can take.
Tinakwe Elizabeth, you've asked a question about a rough timeline on consultation. Can't provide a timeline just at the moment, but I guess kind of watch this space. We do hope to be going back to stakeholders with more information, hopefully in the next few months. Gary has asked about vehicle license plate recognition and whether this could be considered a form of behavioural biometrics. So interested in Ella's thoughts on this too. My thought would be it's obviously a privacy concern, but it's not biometrics because it's not, it's certainly not, clearly not related to the human body, and I'm not sure that I would consider it related, that it's behavioural either.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Ewan.
Yeah, but it's obviously still covered by the broad protections under the Privacy Act.
And Jack's asked about applying retroactively if a code was brought in to biometric information that was already captured. That is interesting. I don't know what you'd say to that, Ewan, but I expect there'd be some sort of provision to account for that, whether it did or yeah. I'd have to think.
Yeah, I think we need to think about that. I probably, yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Now I know there was one that I kind of skipped over because it was a sub question to James's question. It was a question from Justin. Would a code look at regulating what substantial purposes are lawful compared to a process? I guess to regulation of processes is what he's asking. Yeah, it could, but I think it's definitely too soon to say. Sorry, Justin. Right, what else have we got here?
Yeah, thanks for your comment there, Karen. Yeah, it's often true that, I think Clearview AI was an example of, well, there's a lot happening in the facial recognition space that's sort of been going on without people's awareness. And so I think that did make privacy regulators sit up and think, what do we need to do here? And yes, I agree, any signage also needs to be really understandable.
Okay. I think we might have covered at least to the best of our abilities, most, if not all, of the questions now. But do remember that if you have any further questions, by all means, come back to that email address, biometrics@privacy.org.nz. Do we want to take this last one about whether the Madison Square Garden example was an inappropriate use of biometric information?
I think it's a really interesting case where, yeah, it raises questions about, you know, as a society, what are we happy with this? You know, can we do we have a right to move about with anonymity? You know, freedom of movement, and yeah, obviously there's privacy elements, but there's also maybe a broader conversation that needs to be had in society about this. And so yeah, we're really looking forward to engaging with targeted stakeholders, but then also hearing from you guys about yeah, where the boundaries are. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we might have to close off there. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. And thanks everyone for their questions, comments, for your participation throughout Privacy Week. And go and have a celebratory Privacy Week drink now. And we hope to see you again next year.
Ka kite.
Ka kite anō.